Okay, we shall start. Welcome everyone. Welcome our guest. Today, Erinç Yeldan with us. He present the rethinking the role of central banks under the age of Anthropocene. I think there is no need to introduce him. All of you know. So we shall start. Please, hocam, floor is yours.
Thank you, Oktay. Dear colleagues, welcome all. Today I'm going to make a controversial statement about the role of central banks in combating climate change. As always argued in the introduction to such talks, my opening line is that this is ongoing research. Nothing is definite. Nothing is final. And today, Burcu Ünlüvar has kind of joined with us. I rely on most of the arguments that we developed together with her. Burcu hocam, welcome home once again. Let me start by saying that we are thinking the role of the central banks. Age of Anthropocene. What does it mean? Well, it's the current geological age, and it is viewed as the period during which human activity has been the dominant influence. The Homo sapiens is responsible in its actions on climate and environment. Well, a few slides in order about the size of the problem. This I have taken from the UNCTAD 2019 report. The carbon dioxide concentration in our atmosphere had been accumulating at an alarming speed. It had increased more than 2/3, almost twice since the onset of the Industrial Revolution. The bulk of the activity happening actually after the Second War. These are the parts per million molecules, the number of carbon dioxide molecules in per million molecules in our atmosphere. The threshold is 450 ppm. That is associated with accumulated warming of 2 centigrades since the Industrial Revolution. And this is the data from the Berkeley Earth website. Many similar data are possible. That global warming is a phenomenon, and that's something we are dealing with. Now, another slide that I have borrowed from the International Energy Agency, its director, Mr. Fatih Birol, about the COP21, the so-called Paris 2015. After 2015, there had been pledges, and the carbon dioxide emissions projections by the International Agency back then, that will be compatible with a 2-degree scenario, not 1.5, but 2-degree, that the global carbon dioxide emissions in our atmosphere, only the carbon dioxide, should be reduced to less than 20 gigatons, 20 billion tons of carbon dioxide to be consistent with a 2-degree scenario since the Industrial Revolution. What had been pledged, promised, put on the table in Paris 2015 in COP21. However, at the most optimistic trends, put the projections, even under the most optimistic projections, to more than 36 billion tons of carbon dioxide, with a difference of about 18 gigatons of a difference that need to be complemented. The International Energy Agency was also offering certain solutions, and I simply borrowed them: energy efficiency, technology switching, renewables, nuclear. I'm not debating anything here. I'm just simply carrying on their message. This was how they thought to fill this 18 billion tons of difference between what had been pledged and what ought to be. Similar data had been published. This is data by the Climate Action Tracker. Very recently, last week, the IPCC had also published its own similar record of where the world is heading towards the end of the century, that under even the most optimistic policies, we are heading to a 2.8 degrees Celsius increase, even with the pledges, and what ought to be really consistent with a 1.5 degree target is really a very ambitious target to be pursued. So it's no doubt that current state of affairs, even at the most optimistic pledges, is away from the realities. Let's talk about economics, the language that economists used to hear, in addition to all the doomsday scenarios about new forms of bacteria, new diseases, rise of the sea levels, all the dramatic Hollywood stories. In the language of the economists, potential output losses due to heat stress, according to ILO, the International Labour Organization, as a percentage of regional GDP, will be by year 2030 on the order of 2% for the low-income countries, on the order of 4.5% for the low middle-income countries. But for the high middle income and the highest income countries, the expected output losses due to heat stress only at the factory shop level, the decline in productivity will be unevenly distributed around the world. This will amount to roughly on the order of $2.5 trillion of potential loss of output. In the words of the World Bank, the potentially devastating consequences of inaction from an unprecedented decline in biodiversity, with roughly 1 million animal and plant species at risk of extinction. The rich men and women's World Economic Forum declined that roughly half of global gross domestic product, about 44 trillion worth of economic value, depends on the natural world in some way, meaning its destruction represents an enormous financial loss. Moody's, the financial giant, sectors that have high or very high inherent exposure to natural capital report almost $2 trillion in rated debt. Against all these, what do we have at Arsenal in terms of combating, as an economist, as the economics profession said? Carbon markets, emission trading systems, carbon offsets, carbon capture and storage, technological aspirations, dreams of machines capturing carbon for years to come. Net zero emission pathways, the keyword is net. So we are going to continue emitting carbon dioxide in strategic industries, whomever they are, but we are going to net them out by reforestation, offsets, and with pledges. The economist, the mainstream approach is right to pollute and achieving a social optimum, and typically at junior level applied macroeconomic courses or environmental economics courses, we typically discuss these in abstractions of individual firms. Some firm A, somewhat efficient in that marginal abatement costs of reducing pollution is lower than some firm B. Well, if we arbitrarily put quotas, let's say 50-50, there will be differences in marginal costs, which is efficiency losses, unoptimal resource allocation. It's almost the end of the world, but we allow them to trade right to pollute. They come through the workings of the market to a market optimum where marginal costs are equalized. Everyone is happy. We are reducing pollution in a first best efficient manner, and the world is on a target path, doing something efficiently. That is the story. Now, this story, when it's applied to, let's say, in the European Union, in its emissions trading system, ETS, roughly starting from 2005, but mostly increasing its ambition since 2012. This is the total pathway historically realized total emissions of EU, with the red lines, the emissions of the sectors that are under emission trading system, these firm A's, firm B's. As you see, this whole thing is moving so slowly that over the last 30 years, reduction in total emissions under the scheme is on the order of about only 20%, according to data. When this is contrasted against the world data, there is a stunning dwarfing of all these efforts. The blue lines again, the European Union's emissions, and while the global emissions are increasing, that these policies are not working to the desired speed. So many things had been done, had been announced, had been promised, including Turkey with its official nationally determined contributions, with China promising that they are not that it's not going to open up new coal-based electricity plants starting today, and after 2015 they will be reducing their emissions towards net zero by 2070. India, big polluters like South Africa, Poland have all made very optimistic pledges, but this is where we are heading. So it is not a finished story. A lot of divergence. I got this slide from the Shell about Shell's propaganda in its drive to carbon neutral. All you have to do is get a Shell card. With the Shell card, enabling your fleet to drive carbon neutral can play a key role in low carbon planning, it says, allowing you to offset unavoidable carbon emissions that are just unavoidable. That's why our new carbon offsetting leads to how does it work? It's easy. You just opt in offset for carbon emissions from your fleet. Shell tracks your fleet overall fuel consumption. It will issue an annual verified carbon reduction certificate so that it will offset all your emissions so that you can just sleep well and happy. Climate Market Watch and a private institution on following the emissions and what's been going on in the climate markets announces that the windfall profits by sectors to brown, most polluting industries, refineries, petrochemicals, cement, iron and steel, from a surplus European Union allowances, offsets from their oligopoly practices of average cost pass-throughs amount to 11.3 billion for refineries, 5 billion for petrochemicals, 10 billion for cement, 16 billion for iron and steel, so that at the expense of all expectations of otherwise, actually most polluting industries are earning money from the operations of these carbon market systems. In essence, they are adding more profits, to the contrary to expectations of innovations promised. So against this background, why do we green the central banking operations? Why is there a need to? Carney, in his report to the BBC in 2020, argued that the global financial system is actually responsible. The global financial system was effectively funding temperature increases of over 3 degrees centigrade, double the threshold set by the climate community. That if we do not restrict and reorient the financial system along with the central banks, the business as usual is actually increasing the pollutions at unlimited space and pace. Greenpeace and WWF, in their report called The Big Smoke, they estimated that carbon emissions with the financial institutions, FIs, in 2019 in England amounted to 805 million tons of CO2. Banks 415, asset managers 390 million tons of emissions. This is almost twice the UK's domestically produced emissions. George Monbiot, in his report that had been spelled out in The Guardian in 2022, he argued that against reforestation ambitions, he argued that there is simply not enough land on Earth to soak up corporate greenhouse gas emissions. And he quotes Oxfam in its estimate that the land required to meet carbon removal plans by businesses could amount to 5 times the size of India, more than the entire area of farmland on our planet. And much of this land actually belongs to indigenous people who in many cases do not have any consent in these plans, and he attributes this to the phrase carbon colonialism. Larry Lohmann, in his interview, argues that carbon markets are not designed to reduce emissions. Their function, as in the Paris Agreement and elsewhere, is to extend the life of the fossil fuel economy and indirectly an exploitative and unequal system of extractivism and nature degradation. This is a projection published by the Bank of England, the most outspoken of the central banks towards greening its operations, arguing that in the most polluting industries, coal, oil, and gas, its projections from historical production to countries' production plans and projections are way too much, are completely inconsistent with the production levels consistent with either 2 degrees or 1.5 degrees Celsius consistent plans. So Bank of England argues that there is still a very important role for itself as a central bank to combat this phenomenon. Sümeyye, one of our graduate students in her PhD thesis, compiled data for Turkey, where the share of banking sector credits is completely offline with share of sectorial emissions of the so-called scope 1, 2, and 3. That is, each sector's responsibility in emissions in its final demand against other remaining sectors of the economy, with retail trade, electricity, agriculture, iron and steel off the mark very strongly. So against all this background, Dikao and Walls argued in their ADBI working paper that we need the design of a green central bank. What do we understand from it? It's a central bank that takes environmental risks, including climate change, into considerations in its actions. And they call for a more climate conscious central banking mandate. What does this mean? According to François Villeroy de Galhau, the governor of the Bank of France, climate change does affect our ability to achieve price stability. Christine Lagarde, the president of the ECB in 2021, argued that it is pretty obvious climate change will have and has already an impact on price stability. Robbins and his colleagues in 2021 has already announced that net zero central banking is a new phase in greening the financial system. Now observe that these quotations are not calling for any radical departure from central banking's so-called traditional mainstream mandate in price stability or questioning their mandate. They are recognizing that climate change is affecting and had already started affecting central banks' abilities to achieve their narrow-minded price stabilities. So even within the constraints of a traditional mainstream orthodox central banking mandate, climate change is some phenomena that ought to be taken into action. Schnabel argued that realization of climate change could further diminish the space for conventional monetary policy by exogenously affecting the equilibrium real rate of interest, reducing its effectiveness of the central bank's instruments of monetary control. So even if you are trying to deal with the price stability using the traditional policy of setting the rate of interest, its effectiveness will be reduced due to the realizations of climate change. Both climate change and policies to mitigate its effects will undoubtedly have a direct impact on inflation dynamics, where short-term fluctuations in output and inflation could as well amplify longer-term macroeconomic volatility. Eichengreen concludes that ignoring these issues or saying that they are someone else's problem from the echelons of the Olympian mountains is no longer an option. How shall we do all of these? What are the best examples of monetary policy to combat climate change through a green central bank? First, a quote from or a caution from Westergaard, who argues that what constitutes appropriate policy in normal times and crisis times ought to be distinguished in central banking discourse. And we are not in normal times anymore. He continues and identifies the green policy mix with the following three objectives, sine qua non, even not open to debate. One, they have to signal a substantive mitigating effect. Two, it should entail no significant, no negative impact on the effectiveness of monetary policy. And three, they should not carry potential negative consequences for market liquidity. So even under these very narrow constraints, a green central bank, according to Robbins, DeCao, and Walls in their report on net zero central banking, it consists of a strategy where central banks and supervisors will need to develop a net zero roadmap. This should include the promotion of liaison and coordination between central banks, supervisors, and policymakers. The prudential regulation, they should make net zero a core element of supervisory practice, requiring all regulated financial institutions to submit net zero transition plans. A monetary policy where central banks need to consistently integrate climate change into monetary frameworks, carry out models to adequately account for the impacts of climate change on macroeconomic outcomes. A portfolio management, sustainable and responsible investment practices for central banks' portfolios should include a net zero target, and central banks should publish a transition plan to achieve this. Transition should be a just transition. Central banks should explore the implications of net zero for jobs and livelihoods to mitigate potential downside sectoral and regional consequences. Bank of England had already announced an interim portfolio target relative to net zero pathways with a range of scientific net zero pathways, and Bank of England's target as of 2025 and made its projections publicly available to achieve this net zero pathway, and why and how the Bank of England will announce its monetary policy. Bank of England announced certain tools under 4 headings: targets, eligibility, tilting, and escalation of ambitions. Targets. It had already announced an ultimate target to achieve net zero emissions associated with the corporate bond purchases schedule, the CBPS, by 2050. Intermediate target guiding near-term investment decisions. 25% reduction in the weighted average carbon intensity of the corporate bond portfolio by 2025. Eligibility. Firms ineligible for further purchases of bonds unless they meet climate governance requirements in line with UK government requirements. Tilting. They announced that they are going to tilt purchases of corporate bonds towards strong climate performance and away from weaker performance, using a scorecard incorporating level of emissions, past reductions, publications of disclosures, publication of verification and emission reductions, so on and so forth. So they are going to, they have openly announced that they are openly tilt their purchases towards climate performers and away from weaker performers. They are going to escalate their efforts, review calibration of corporate bonds, greening annually. They will increase requirements as coverage and robustness of data to improve, escalate intensity of actions, including loss of eligibility, divestment, where climate performance is inadequate. In terms of practice, our own summarization with my colleague Burcu Ünüvar, our own summarization from Bayer in a tabulation of green policies with direct goals of informational, incentive-based, and quantitative-based actions differentiated. Under informational tools, we recognize expanding the climate-related information to market participants, bridging the market failures stemming from imperfect and asymmetric information. What are the tools? Develop climate risk assessment models, increase and identify disclosure requirements, supply a green taxonomy. Under incentive-based goals, make low carbon strategies financially more convenient, use differentiated capital requirements and or reserve requirements across sectors, introduce collateral frameworks, introduce asset purchase programs as the Bank of England. Quantity-based goals, impose direct control over financial flows, impose minimum credit floors, impose sectoral credit quotes, impose maximum credit ceilings across sectors according to the green taxonomy. All within the realm of orthodox monetary policy. Now, towards discussion and some of the concluding comments of what all these amount to. First of all, on the issue of the so-called neutrality. There are arguments out there that tilting or skewing asset purchases to favor green financial assets would actually be against the market neutrality principle. And in fact, it is against the Article of the European Union Treaty. Yet, according to Schnabel, first of all, markets might not be the best benchmark for market neutrality. Popozzi and his colleagues argued that sectors with high emission shares are currently overrepresented in ECB's portfolio, and its market neutrality in the first place is already being questioned. Bayer and his colleagues argued that a de jure principle of not choosing leads to a de facto choice in favor of polluting activities. So the idea that a central bank should be a bystander, a referee, neutral to against all sectors is actually a choice in favor of polluting activities, and it's not acceptable. To recap, colleagues, climate change is definitely a planetary problem. However, its effects are not symmetric across the global economy. Poor nations, developing countries are suffering more, and according to the green taxonomy, the polluting industries are enjoying windfall profits against all intentions spelled thus far. Central banks will have to shift towards a more active policy stance that is more engaged with elimination of structural bottlenecks rather than market neutrality instrumentalization in their pursuit of price stability, often displayed along with esoteric communication languages. And Burju's motto, green central banks, is now a question of how rather than if. Thank you all. That's my story. Back to you folks.
Thank you so much hocam. Can you hear
I
me?
will be very happy to get your reactions, comments, critiques.
Can you hear me?
Yes,
Yeah,
we are all.
We are in the question and answering part. Please ask your question to the Professor Yeldan. Thank you hocam, by the way, for this
Rica ederim.
great presentation. We are waiting for the questions. I think Burcu Hoca has a question.
Burcu Hocam, please go ahead. Then let's take Mr. Özkan.
Yeah. Hocam, thank you very
akşamlar.
much. Inspiring as always. Just want to sincerely learn your opinion, or I don't know, wishful things about the future of the inflation targeting in the world, because he always says that central banks can be too precious of instruments, in fact, and they should not be wasted on perhaps single targets. And in this planetary problem, we need every kind of help we can get, because it's also creating a huge inequality, and it's pressing the bottom part of the society. So we should also consider the inequality part. So do you think we still have inflation targeting as the ABC of the markets in our future? Thank you.
Well, Burcu, you are such a provoker.
Gladly.
Well, let me just spell out very openly and plainly, but within the tradition of the discipline, let me say. Inflation targeting, as we all know the history, has emerged out of perhaps a necessity, but more of a pragmatic need back in early 1990s, first by the New Zealand Central Bank, then Chile, then Bank of Canada, Bank of England, and all the way today, including the Central Bank of Republic of Turkey. Well, what was the background? My reading is that the banks or the monetary economists had realized that under conditions of an open capital account with full integration to the international financial markets, actually there is not much a domestic central bank can do that the so-called policy trilemma of the interest rate setting, the choice of the exchange rate regime, and the determination of the exchange rate and the capital account system, that under this actually trilemma disappears. All collapse to one single entity of the financial arbitrage that we, with Özgür Hoca, we calculated for Turkey with the interest rate and exchange rate appreciation collapsing into one single instrument. And there isn't much, especially in the context of the emerging market economies, central banks, whose financial markets are shallow, premature, they do not have much at the background. So it was argued that best a central bank can do under these conditions is to make projections and make an announcement against these projections. So it was actually had to be called not inflation targeting, but inflation projections that they are going to share with the public. They are going to announce policies against their projected inflation rates. And you all know the story. What if they fail their projected targets? Nothing much. They all write an apologetic letter in what I say in esoteric language, setting out the reasons why they missed the targets, and then the whole game continues. Back in 2009, Yılmaz Akgüz Hoca has concluded in his assessment of the 2009 crisis that what the crisis had taught us is that targeting only price inflation is not sufficient to achieve macroeconomic stability. That financial stability objectives, including asset prices, among which exchange rate is also a being asset, should also be the consideration of targeting. Well, once you start expanding the central bank's objective and its operational tools to include asset prices, the price of the real exchange rate, commodity prices, then of course one policy tool of setting the interest rate would not be enough. You have to go back to setting the reserve requirement ratios, playing around with the corridors, playing around with the interventions to the free mobility of foreign finance capital. So we are away from inflation targeting for practical reasons as well. On the Turkish historical episode, the inflation targeting framework meant two things. First, announcing the future pathway of inflation for the next 12 months or 12 to 24 months. It had meant practically reducing the real exchange rate, a real wage rate, and increasing or deepening the income worsening consequences. And two, it also meant a complete misalignment on the exchange rate, first towards significant appreciation in the first decade of 20s, and then a significant volatility and a complete loss of control over the exchange rate management. And then a climate crisis and its effects with losses in output, losses in employment, volatility in food prices, in energy prices, had also meant further concerns for all central banks. So I think I am of the opinion that even at the most orthodox circles, a very narrow mandate of price inflation to be pursued by a single, rather conveniently singled out policy tool, the policy interest rate, in a rhetoric of "it's not my business" anymore will not suffice. So the 2020s will pressure the central banks, rich and poor countries equally, to go beyond simple-minded inflation targeting objectives and associated policies, and try to increase their objective set and policy set. This what I believe that we shall see.
Thank you very much.
Dağlar.
My question is about impact on economy. So I'm not sure if in the end your policy advice will be about for Turkey or for the whole world in general. But regardless, if the central banks constrain credit or financing to real sector industries that are high polluters, there will be some sort of economic losses on the industrial side. I think for Turkey, this might be slightly unwanted, since we want to have higher exports, a better external balance, and usually stuff that we do on the high polluting sectoral activities are related to some degree exporting to exports, for example, in glass and ceramics. So I'm thinking on the external balance, this would be slightly bad for Turkey, and it might trigger some unwanted deindustrialization if we cut financing to those areas. So for Turkey, I think it's maybe slightly dangerous. Maybe when you cut finance, they might be forced to be more productive. But how do you feel about this this problem that effectively we are going to give very big shocks to the output?
Very important question, a very important issue, no doubt. But first of all, thanks you for reminder. This is not a narrow Turkish central bank recommendations or policy discussion, but it's I intentionally put this as a more global and general central banking discussion. Of course, there are intricacies of the local Turkish monetary policy making that goes beyond greening the central bank. There are unavoidably important issues out there. That being said, at the global level, perhaps from the point of view of developing countries, first of all, monetary policy will not suffice, and monetary policy is not the driving climate policy that economies will follow. It will necessarily have an accommodative role. The main role will be the technology policy, no doubt, and fiscal policy in setting subsidies, giving out taxes, and setting the green industries and green transition a first best pathway. There is no doubt. But what we observe is that the global financial system is not in line with the objective of fighting against climate change. That the financial system in its operations currently is actually diverting funds away from green transition and green industries, sustaining and creating a vested interest in polluting activities. Whatever the traditional economists' policy tools in the emission trading systems, in carbon markets, the offsets, the reforestation, they are actually serving to the reverse, that the polluting industries are in fact making more money due to misalignments, mistreatments, losses in objectives from England to the most poorest nation in the world. Finance is operating for polluting industries. Transition to a green economy will be costly, no doubt, but the climate diplomacy has reached a level that if we do not collaborate, with the world out there, the losses of being singled out will be even greater. European Union has already announced plans on its carbon border adjustment, taxation, and other mechanisms. The net zero emission pathways being singled out will divert both technology transfer, FDI, the incoming new industrial revolution in these plans. So postponement will have more costs ignoring the transition. And all it's being argued is that finance and monetary policy should collaborate with the fiscal policy and with the technology policy. And there is a big role for the central banks in that regard. That's, I guess, the main message. But in individual cases, there will definitely be indigenous costs, special circumstances that could be dealt with different timelines, different introduction mechanisms, and different policy objectives. But the central banks should be part of the story. That's, I think, the bottom line. Hoping that it is a bit clarifying questions, but that's an optimistic trend that I can share with you. I see Selva, and then Sinan. I was going to get worried that, but let's have Selva talk first, and then Sinan. Buyurun Selva.
Erinç Hocam, thank you so much. It was such an inspiring discussion and a new topic. Also to my PhD thesis. For those who don't know me, I'm a veteran investment banker and a newly PhD candidate working on national security and international political economy, and what are the consequences if you do not connect those two contexts. To very interesting information, maybe you will be excited about it. I was actually one of the fundraisers of a carbon fund a decade ago, and I have been experienced an enormous time of my professional life, almost 2 years, by generating this fund. And I can give you some insights if you like to some other time maybe, and why the market has already collapsed back in 2011. And I think greening the central bank cannot be done without a proper regulatory environment, because in that context we were actually I mean, as Larry Lohmann said, you know, they never target the limiting the carbon emissions. In fact, they were targeting transferring the capital from the carbon emission producers to green technology in the developing countries. But this inter-country transnational capital movement had already created in an unregulated market a kind of a fraud, which actually make most of the Deutsche Bank professionals to go to jail at the period of time. So my specific question was, how can we green a central banking in the global scale without thinking the regulatory and the philosophical side of the game? What I'm trying to say, greening the economy of 2.5 quadrillion hedge funds, which is actually creating a huge asset bubble in each and every time of the financial crisis. These carbon assets or asset-backed securities creating from the carbon emissions can also create a kind of a bubble. So how we can collaborate this regulatory mindset and with the green central banking? This is one of the questions that I have. And the second question is, when you say carbon emissions or climate change, it's a security risk. So how can we make central banking sensitive to security risks, not only to climate change, but also some other securities, saying which, for example, for Turkey, some of the industries can be more national security sensitive. As in Italy, it was some other industries are more security sensitive. So can we bring a dynamic approach to what you're actually approaching to in the context of climate change to any of the industrial or sectoral or social dynamics which make the individual economies or totally global economies much more secure and national security friendly? Thank you so much.
Two important, many thanks, Selva. Two important precautions. First, we can't. I mean, climate abatement policies have to be consistent, collaborative, and global. This is not only true for central banking policies, but for prudential regulation, whatever the quotation in the prudential means, or whatever the boundaries of being prudential entail. And your second question, the security issue of certain strategic sectors, their securitization requirements against emissions abatement objectives. But if you really think about what you put in front of us, these are issues that go beyond the central bank monetary policy or the finance, but towards all our approach to the need for climate action. And we can extend our arguments in favor of more strict and more restrictive technological change policies, more restrictive fiscal policies, and of course start discussing whether all of these are meaningful within the capitalist system that in a mode of economy where profit seeking is the primary objective in private markets with externalities, with omission of social costs. Do any of these individually tailored policies suffice? Of course, they won't. So at a more broader scale, we will have to argue for inclusion of a social cost and social benefit analysis and introduce externalities into our production and consumption decisions. When we say that the private market is efficient, we are actually making a gross mistake here, because these efficiency parameters are involving only private costs, private gains, whereas the costs to the society in terms of damage of natural resources and the burden imposed upon our planet and the next generations, once these are internalized in, we realize that the seeking motive in a private cost-benefit analysis ceases to be efficient. It is the most inefficient mode of allocation of resources. So, including the monetary policy, going beyond the Pigovian corrective taxes framework, we need to impose more restrictive measures. Phasing out of coal is one of them, and making our evaluations not in terms of private costs or evaluated at market prices, but at social costs, evaluated at social costs of the environment. If you look at the picture from this angle, I will think that both fiscal policy and incomes policy actions will make more sense. If you or any of my colleagues are now asking, well, can we all do this in a profit-driven capitalist market economy? Well, we have to come together for that topic in a more prepared fashion. My own vote is that it's highly improbable, impossible. But what to do next is, of course, another matter of questioning. But thank you for your considerations and the concerns. Very important. And good luck in your dissertation as well. Sinan, are you all well? Did you recover?
So hocam, unfortunately.
Okay, çok geçmiş olsun tekrardan. Buyur.
Çok teşekkür. My question is actually so similar, Selva hocam, I think, a kind of continuation of her question. During the Bretton Woods era, central banks acted like a sort of development banks as well. After the rising of protectionist policies and also this kind of environmental policies via central banks seems triggered the emerging of some questions in the literature. In this sense, can we say that after all of this kind of developments, central bank would act like a development bank in the future? Again, like in Eastern Asian countries, Japan, Korea, Taiwan, etc.
Okay, well, am I missing your question, or
actually my question is to implement environmental policies via a central bank. Can we say that central bank will regain a development bank role in economic policies or not?
Well, apart from the climate abatement policies in a very narrow sense, apart from the sense, central banks ought to serve as development banks. They are the lender of the last resort. I mean, this is the rationale of having a central bank. And they have been created historically in serving their functions, resolving crises, part of the rescue effort along with their states or with the financial system. That's part of their rationale as the central bank. Now, that rationale the argument that could be served with very narrow single objective of inflation targeting is, I think, has proven wrong, at best insufficient. It is part of their role to reallocate financial funds to support technological change, to support employment, to support sectoral allocation of resources is their role. Now, to argue that this role can be satisfied only if creating an inflation target and playing around with the policy interest rate to attain that inflation target, and to write a letter if you fail in your objectives is completely a very narrow decision that had proven itself insufficient. It may be, as you phrased, assuming a role of a developing planner, development bank. Be it may. I mean, there could be more fancy names for that new role of monetary policy that ought to be in collaboration, allocating resources, restricting and redesigning the financial sector's requirements. And as Dağlar had reminded, it's not only a matter of local central banks. It's not sufficient for the Turkish central bank to allocate finance within the Turkish financial market. It ought to be a global financial redirection. And that's why it's important, I guess, here the actions of the European Central Bank and the Bank of England taking such initiatives that it really is an interesting phenomena that the developed country central banks, including the European Bank, are into that mindset already. I find this very innovative. But if you call this a development bank, I don't have a problem. But other people and economists might find it misleading. So I suggest to use the esoterics of the Oxford language a little bit more creative fashion.
Hocam, I wonder this topic actually a little bit regarding Keynesian Green Deal, new Keynesian Green Deal as well.
That's a valid comparison. Of course, the genie is out of the bottle now, but a new Keynesian, a new financial set of regulations, a new technology policy with states assuming more active and leading responsibilities are all, I guess, now the realities of the 21st century. Not for nostalgic reasons, but that's it. That's. I mean, if you take the Energy Agency or IPCC reports seriously in their findings or their projections, that in order to contain the global warming at 1.5 degrees Celsius, we have a carbon budget of only 500 gigatons, and the world already is emitting 50 gigatons per year. We have a dozen years to reach that target, or to exhaust that budget. After then, there will be a significant loss of output new bacteria, decline in agricultural productivity, new ways of output losses. These will start costing lives and money. And the World Bank and the World Economic Forum that I have highlighted has a series of concerns that I did not put time and space to put in flyers, but 10 years, I mean, so it's not a fantasy, it's not a rhetoric anymore.
Thank you, hocam.
Hocam, we have the last question, I think, which is coming from the Ezgi Varol, and then we can conclude because we are at almost 9:00.
Definitely. Thank you, Oktay. Thank you, Ezgi. Go ahead.
First of all, thank you so much, Erinç hocam, for this valuable information. I wanted to ask about actually growth. I know there is like broad discussions on the topic, but as you know, European Union Green Deal plans for a pathway for circular economy right now. And I just want to get your thoughts about, do you think we need to rethink growth in this context?
We have to rethink the shape of growth, the characteristics of growth. We have to incorporate social cost-benefit analysis into our equations and treat natural capital as natural capital. That is, we cannot substitute polluting physical capital against natural capital. We cannot ignore the footprint that we impose upon our planet and on the future generations for the name of faster growth today. This at best will entail losses in the short run to be compensated with a new transition based on renewables, renewable jobs, production based on digitalization, artificial intelligence, and based on cleaner industries, which have higher employment elasticities in comparison to the fossil fuel-based industries. But this will not happen overnight. None of these big changes in industry happened overnight and without due costs. This is our hope, really. And the more we delay this action, the costlier and painful it becomes. My own perception as an economist is that in 10 to 20 years before we reach the so-called 2050 net zero targets of many countries, the production conditions will start to impose themselves in, like, God forbid, COVID-like new pandemics, loss in output in agriculture, new diseases, new bacteria. To scare you a little bit, let me share you with the findings that the melting of ice in the polar regions is often associated with rise of the sea level, that Istanbul will be underwater, But it's not it only. They are finding out bacteria dating from the Spanish flu trapped in ice in Antarctica, that with the melting of ice, they will be released out. That's only the type of bacteria that we are aware of. There will be others. They will be out in the planet that had been trapped and frozen for millions of years, perhaps. Not only the humans, but the plant life could be affected. We do not know. These uncertainties will reveal themselves. And when I said that their social costs need to be incurred in our decisions, then the quest for profit-driven industrialization at fossil fuels, it's after all the fats and oil of animals who lived millions of years ago, fossils, that we have to keep them underground against more serious problems. Can we make a transition in technology that will substitute for the fossil fuels? I think that's where the future of humanity will go. Saying that, well, we cannot do that, and let's just continue with the business as usual is no longer an option. And all, I guess, our intention today in the last 1 hour and so is to show that the central banks should not be a bystander to all of these happening, and they have important roles. And as Dallar has reminded us once again, sorry for quoting you, Dallar, but these will cost. I mean, these will cost output, these will cost employment, these will have inefficiency costs. But in the short run, that's what I hope to think.